Welcome, everybody. I think it's just us. And we are streaming. I'm Ethan Collier, and I'll be chairing today's meeting. I don't have an agenda in front of me. Just a work session.
I can speak to that if you want. Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to say welcome to this work session to talk about the City of Chattanooga zoning ordinance. I just want to say a few things about the development of the zoning ordinance draft. It started probably more than 2 years ago. This is the first comprehensive draft, I think, in the modern history of the City of Chattanooga zoning ordinance. And I just want to give a lot of credit to, we have a consultant who's not here, so I'll just mention them. Camiros has been working with us for 2 years, but I really want to give a lot of credit to the staff. Karen Rennick, Brian Schultz, Emily Wood, Cassie, all of the staff that have been working on this for some time with a lot of meetings. From my point of view, this update is not, it's more of an organizational update. It's definitely adding some future flexibility to us. As you'll see, there's districts that are proposed in the new ordinance that aren't mapped, may not be mapped until after we get a new comprehensive plan. But this zoning ordinance is positioning us for the future. So again, we can talk about that more in a little while. But I do want to just say this is absolutely developing this draft zoning ordinance with the idea in mind that we are going to have a new comprehensive plan for just the City of Chattanooga in 2024 that this zoning ordinance will help us implement. So that's a key point about this update. There's more to come in terms of vision and how we intend to use this ordinance. I'm going to stop there. Next slide, Brian. I guess I'll cover this slide. I think was mine. There's a lot of goals here. I'd start with just the mayor's One Chattanooga strategic plan, which definitely this is all about trying to create more housing choices, not just, again, through this zoning ordinance update, but through our comprehensive plan when it's adopted. We trying to simplify things, get rid of outdated language. Everything that's on here is things that we've kept in mind as we've been updating the zoning ordinance. I'm going to, in the interest of keeping us on track with our time today, I'm just going to go to the next slide, which I think I'm handing off to Karen. I think this is still maybe my slide. Let me know, Karen. Our timeline for this update, we're trying to get this before council this year so that council can have the prerogative to do what they want with this in terms of the timeline. But we did commit about a year and a half ago that we would have the zoning ordinance draft completed by the end of this year. And so as of today, we have officially met that milestone. I think I covered some of the project overview. Again, please think of this as in terms of this zoning ordinance and other things to come, and including mapping districts, not just mapping existing districts, which will be required to keep everything legal in the coming months, but also, in the future, other uses of potentially mapping future districts. We do have a good legal team involved, of course, our city attorney's office, but also George Dean we have available to us, who's a zoning and constitutional lawyer here in the state of Tennessee. I'm going to move to the next slide and just say, again, we want to get through this. We do have a public input form. If we had somebody from the public today that at home that wants to scan that, they can go present some information in the survey. Here again is our schedule. We're hoping to have this before the Planning Commission in November, and then get it before City Council this year, again, before the end of the year. I'm going to keep going, just in the interest of time, keeping us move forward. I'm going to hand off to Karen. And Karen, I think, and Brian are going to sort of tag team over the next 20-something slides, and then we'll have some questions. If you would, we're happy to answer questions as they go through the presentation. But if we could kind of keep discussion of policy and the implications of some of this to a minimum. Again, today is to talk about what's in this document and not so much to talk about what it might mean if we put a certain district on some Brainerd Road or something 5 years in the future. My point is I don't want to try to get into discussions of policy today if we can avoid that and just get through the document. everybody understanding what's in here if that's possible.
Hey, could I ask a quick question about process?
Sure.
So I noticed on the timeline that it's going from today's session to a public release, and then going straight from that to our planning commission agenda.
That's true.
I'm just thinking back to the recent subdivision regs process and wondering about the degree of public input at the PC.
Sure. So the subdivision regs, as y'all well know, is pretty much a focus of industry, the engineering industry, this development industry, building industry. And it stops with the planning commission. I mean, we've had some discussion of the sub regs since then with the city attorney, but in general, the subdivision regs don't go before council. This document is absolutely a document that's adopted by city council. And so city council will have their prerogative to review this and manage this however they want. We don't anticipate a lot of industry input in this any more than I'd expect, the retail industry. So again, I think this is an iteration, as I've tried to convey to folks. This is trying to get our zoning ordinance to a point where we can actually use it as a modern document for other things. This is not an endpoint. This is not a once in a generation thing. We should be looking at our zoning ordinance all the time, if not at least annually. And so that's the intention of this, is just to get us a document that we can manage and we can use and be more confident with next year. So I hope that helps. But I don't expect the kind of public engagement, industry engagement that we had around the sub-regs. I don't expect that in this, but I could be wrong.
Okay. And we do have, this is a public meeting. It was advertised to be a public meeting. It is live streaming. We have one participant here, but she's a Bloomberg Fellow with the City of Chattanooga and kind of has 1 foot helping us in planning and 1 foot in housing. So she's been helpful and has great public policy and technical skills. So Hanukkah is kind of here as a staff member also. So just wanted to introduce her.
Karen, before
yes.
you jump in, I just I prepared a couple things that I'd like to read.
Please.
Just and make a couple statements more to staff and the city, just in regards to how when you're going through zoning, some stuff that I want for planning commission to keep in mind, and then hopefully ultimately the city council will as well kind of keep these things in mind. So if I could for just a minute, I get this monthly newsletter from these geniuses somewhere in the country that study everything economic. And one of those things that they touch on every month is housing. And I just want to read off some of the current kind of statements in regards to where we are with housing across the country. And then also read a couple excerpts from the mayor's recent housing action plan that's going to be before city council pretty soon. First of which is home prices have surged by nearly 60% over the past 5 years. The average mortgage payment has increased by 134% since early 2018. So what those numbers look like, January of 2021, the average home price in the United States, listen to these numbers, it's absolutely mind-boggling. The average home price, or the median single-family home price, was $321,000. Today, it's $399,000. So the down payment went from $32,000 to $39,000. Pretty inconsequential change in the whole scheme of things. But with the 30-year mortgage rate going from 2.65 to 7.63, the monthly payment for the median home price in the United States went from $1,166 to $2,547. That's a 134% increase. A lot of what we're going to talk about in the Chattanooga zoning code impacts housing. Mortgage applications have hit a 28-year low as of this last month. So, and then this goes on to describe that it's not just mortgage rates and it's not just the cost of housing, but there are a lot of other pressures like insurance and taxes that are negatively impacting home affordability too. And just as, aside, because of our stormwater regulations, every single new development now has to have an HOA, because whatever stormwater measures are put in place have to be maintained in perpetuity. The developer signs an I&M agreement that they're going to maintain and inspect these stormwater infrastructure pieces forever. So an HOA has to be set up to do that. And so new home developments have that in addition. So there's all sorts of other pressures that are coming. The housing action plan, I just want to read the letter, the cover letter, because most people are not even going to read this, but I know city council will, but planning commission may not. Our mayor, Tim Kelly, says, Chattanooga faces a sizable deficit of affordable housing units. Today, that is even more true. And if we aren't intentional about our housing priorities, it's likely we could see a deficit of upwards of 7,000 affordable housing units by 2030. The rising cost of housing is outpacing the area median income. Our city's housing environment needs improvement. Currently, we're on track to have less than half the number of affordable rental units than we did 10 years ago by 2030. Further in the plan, it's a good plan. Everybody should read it. Well, I don't know if it's a good plan, but there's a lot of written stuff here. I'm not gonna say whether or not it's a good plan. But further on, the executive summary says, like many cities across the country, Chattanooga is facing an affordable housing crisis. Housing supply has not kept pace with the city's economic and population growth, leading to a decline in housing affordability. Fewer households can access homeownership, and rents are rising faster than incomes for most households. Furthermore, the system to provide affordable homes is constrained by limited public funding, state law, and lack of regional partners. As a part of the plan, and the lion's share of the plan is about subsidy, but throughout the plan, in multiple instances, is mentioned land use. And specifically in regards to land use, the plan says land use regulations shape where housing is located, what housing looks like, and how much housing is built. Land use tools can reduce displacement, increase housing supply, stabilize housing costs, and readdress racial segregation. Land use tools cannot meet the needs of the lowest income housing. So I just wanted to say that as we go through this and questions come up, I think it's really important because the folks that drafted this did not have that. They may not have necessarily been thinking about that, but the same city that is putting this document in front of us is putting this document in front of us. And so I don't think one should be considered without the other. And in the case of the housing action plan, it actually makes reference to this coming and the need for it to help address the lack of affordable housing in the city. So I'm now finished. Thank you.
And I'll just say, since I think the housing action plan came out, we have met multiple times with Nicole Heyman and Sydney and to understand what's in there and how zoning and affordability go together. So we have really doubled down on our coordination since that happened. So we'll try to flag a couple times where we did talk about making sure that the zoning ordinance addressed housing affordability, but there's additional options too. So just to do a little bit of housekeeping, the ordinance in front of you is a draft ordinance dated from October 18th. This has not been released publicly. This is the first release kind of outside of the staff. And a draft is not available online yet. So what you have in front of you in the presentation is based on the draft that you have, and the one that staff is working from. And to Matt Law's question about the schedule, there's going to be a 1027 draft. So at the end of this week, Camiris is going to finalize some of the items that are on the cover sheet that still need to be completed. This is the draft that we will post online for the public viewing and will be provided to Planning Commission to meet the schedule that Dan laid out for the November 13th Planning Commission meeting. So at some point you will within the next week, you'll be getting the next draft, and we will note on the cover sheet what's changed since the draft you've got in front of you. And then future task, Dan mentioned mapping, and Chairman Collier, when you mentioned land use, some of that will be how we implement the zone tools. So I think a little bit of the land use side will be the area comprehensive planning that Dan mentioned and mapping. We don't want to get too much into mapping. You kind of have to help out, you should have a sheet that's in also your binder. And this is kind of what is the old zone and what would the new current zone be? So not get too much into mapping and where would that zone be used, but this is a bit of a cheat sheet to answer that question. So when you're thinking about it, kind of helps, and it shows where new zones are and then how old zones relate to new zones. Additionally, there's some extra abbreviations, just working through and ending on the land use table. The land use table is a part of the packet, but just so you have it, or part of your document, just so you have it when you're working through, just a little bit of a handout to help out. The form-based code currently is not integrated into this version of the zoning ordinance. I think that's still a goal of ours. We just weren't able to accommodate all the complexities of that during the time frame we had provided. So we are kind of chunking the sections to review. We need to end, we plan on ending at 4, but we're kind of go through the sections of where we don't have change, proposed changes, and these are pretty standard across all land uses and zones. Brian's going to tackle the residential. I'll come back for mixed use commercial and special and industrial zones. So this is intended to be a work session. We'll try to move promptly, highlight things that have been of interest to Planning Commission previously, but feel free if to ask a question. It is a new ordinance for staff also. So we will do the best we can. We might have to say, we'll come back to you, and then I'd like to reserve the right, if we answer a question and then have to correct it, we will communicate that to you also. So no proposed changes. There's no change to the form-based code in this. Again, we would like to integrate and maybe make some changes in the future. This currently does not have changes to form-based code. One of the items we addressed in trying to address residential affordability, that the building code requires the standard, the ordinance either defers to that standard or references it, with the idea, one of the goals was to not have conflicting codes. Certainly if you see something that's you're aware of that would be a conflict, we'd want to see it. But we did work with LDO pretty closely. They were at I think every single review session we had. So we spent a lot of time on the enforcement side going through it also. Again, there are state law exemptions to reflect in the code. There are some things that state law does not give us the ability to regulate or talks about how that regulation occurs. We are not requiring or incentivizing affordable housing. There is a state law that requires there to not be a direct incentivizing affordable housing event zoning. I think that hopefully might change at some point, but so that is not reflected in the zoning because we don't have state law permissions. The notification process and hearing process generally has not changed. Brian will talk to one of the differences from that, but overall the way we do things is good with that notification and hearing will be continue. The Land Development Office still enforces regulations. And there's been no substantial change to the Board of Zoning Appeals. They do have some additional special permits, but overall the Board of Zoning Appeals is the Board of Zoning Appeals. So again, no proposed changes to short-term vacation rentals or accessory dwelling units. Short-term vacation rental regulations had a recent change that went through Planning Commission that may not be reflective in the zoning ordinance, but that'll be one of the things that gets picked up prior to this week's update. Just overall, there's no tree protection regulations, no additional steep slope or floodplain regulations. Vested property rights are still in play. That's a state law. We've incorporated that. And then again, no change to the application process except for PUDs, and Brian's touching on that. So the section here of proposed changes are things that are kind of encompass all the zones, and these are highlights of these sections. And so there might be a lot of details. I'll try to pull out ones that I think are helpful to Planning Commission, but this is intended to go at a relatively fast clip through some of these items. Sign standards have been removed. The intention is to move them to the sign section of city code. So the form-based code, since we haven't touched that, will still have some sign regulations in it. But we had sections of some of the overlays that had sign regulations. Those are intended to move to city code. Language has been added regarding conditional zoning. And I'll just read this, and then there's an additional, because I think this is important, and this is a little bit more on the mapping side. The conditional zoning in place prior to the effective date of this code shall meet the regulations of all development ordinances effect on the date. So the intention is that we keep conditional zoning, the conditions put in place on zones would carry over. And then with the idea that Dan mentioned with the new area plans and relating to new zones, the city could apply those new zones and over time reduce the amount of conditional zoning. So the intention right now is to move over, is to have a map layer of all those conditional zones, to flag them so those would still be in play. And then as we try to implement the area plans and new zones come into place, it would just essentially remove that old zoning. That is still something that I think that is our plan, and that's just something we're going to have to think about as we retire those conditional zonings. And in the presentation, we'll mention once or twice how we think that's working with the new zoning ordinance. So again, new definitions have been added. Others have been updated, revised. One of the plan goals was to make sure we're addressing emerging technologies. So you'll see some new things. Then there's an administrative modifications process. We know that there's a lot of times we're trying to provide a little bit of relief from the standards that provide, and the quote is minor practical difficulty. So in this, the Land Development Office can provide a modification of 10% or less deviation from zoning standards. It's any dimensional standard, it's any modification to design standard, a reduction in required off-street parking spaces, and a reduction in required bicycle parking. So that you can, instead of having to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals for 10% variation, it would be an application for an administrative modification to the Land Development Office. And then if an administrative modification is denied, it can be resubmitted as a variance. So maybe someone would be heading the variance, the Board of Zoning Appeals route. If it's 10% or less, the idea is to go to the to pursue the administrative modification. If that gets denied, someone still has the opportunity to pursue the variance of the Board of Zoning Appeals. And if there's a question, feel free to want to move quickly but not miss anything. Yes.
Are you required to prove a hardship?
It is right. There is some evaluation criteria. Some of it is similar. But it is just talks about the strict application of the code would result in difficulties as part of the language in the zoning ordinance. It is not the same process as BOZA.
Karen, would you go back to steep slope?
Yes.
You mentioned that a minute. I think since Mr. Fisher's in the room, we worked a year and a half on that steep slope vegetation component.
Correct.
Is this affected at all, or is it removing it?
It is not removing it. It's not impacting that language. That sits in the landscaping code.
It does.
Yeah,
It's not
just wanna
part
make-
of zoning.
Yeah, but it's so good to hear that on record.
It does, yes, that's correct. And I think we try to note in most of our staff reports where there is a slope that is in play, just to flag it for folks.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, and then one of the other notes here is all special exceptions are approved by the Board of Appeals. Right now, Chattanooga City Council acts on special exceptions permit, but generally the guidance provided to us, excuse me, by Cumeros was that these are more of an administrative and not a legislative action. So some examples of permits that would no longer go to the Board of Zoning Appeals are So they would either go to no longer go to council. They would either go to the Board of Appeals or somehow otherwise addressed in code would be existing cemeteries, residential home for handicap or aged persons on a commercial basis, nonprofit heritage educational facility. We're actually addressing that another way. Special exceptions for movement of single family residences. They're not very common. And so the idea is that more administrative function would not be something that goes to city council. But again, there's not a lot of those. So development standards, the zoning code calls these design standards, and we'll get into a little bit more specifics when we get to the residential and then the mixed use. So design standards have been added for non-residential development, includes building articulation, orientation, facade, roof design, and building materials. And again, we can look into that more specifically. And then we also have design standards for it's up to 2 unit. It's like kind of that second bullet, and then multi-unit and townhomes are included in that third bullet. And I think we have a slide specifically addressing those because we know those might be of interest. Parking. We did have several good meetings with our CDOT partners. So this is kind of a general overview. If there's more specific questions, we would probably defer to them and make sure that we understand and how they would interpret it. So there is minimum parking standards for most zones, and a minimum number of bicycle parking spaces are required. So there's a couple of zones that are exempt from minimum parking. And the current ordinance you have, so the current ordinance is one in the urban overlay, 1 parking space per residential unit. The current code does not, the draft code in front of you doesn't have that, and we caught that in our last review. So that will be a change. And that was something we addressed for housing affordability, and that was also something our housing partners wanted to make sure that we weren't requiring too much parking. So that was intended to be in, it got missed. And so the next ordinance update will show that. And there is EV charging spaces are required for lots or structures with more than 30 spaces. There's still shared parking provisions. They've been simplified. So there's a clause about when there's a cessation of that shared parking agreement, but that has become a little bit more streamlined. Off-street parking standards reference the applicable city standard drawing series. This was a lesson learned from the subdivision street standards, that if there's already something out there that's being used, we don't need to duplicate that. So off-street parking just references the city drawings. There are new policies encouraging pervious pavement and adaptive reuse of structures. And I believe that last one is no longer in the ordinance, but I will have to double check that. We've made a couple changes. So again, if there's anything for parking, Darian did a before and after, and this is with the parking ratio for all the uses in the current code and what they would require. And then the new code, it does show a reduction, but we could provide that in a handout for later use. So landscaping, I think one of the things that that was most compelling when we went through it with the consultants was this is still a typical zoning, landscaping, and buffer yard article. We did have some comments about incentivizing tree canopy. That was why we noted that this is not a tree ordinance, a tree protection ordinance. So just to be clear, this is still pretty much zoning, landscaping, and buffering. There is a list of prohibited plants instead of a long list of allowed. So basically it's referencing that if it's not prohibited, in referencing other so it's a if you're in the landscaping field, that's your professional guidance document. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. We do encourage the use of regionally native plants. That's also something that was in the Chattanooga, the resiliency plan, climate action plan, encourage that. And a landscape plan is required for any 3-unit, 4-unit townhouse or multi-unit or non-residential development, including mixed-use development, parking, and parking lot. And I think that is reflective of the current zone. zoning requirements. There's a change to street tree requirement, and then buffer yards replace the concept of a protected zone. So again, those are, we rely a little bit more on our LDO partners on these. So if you have a specific question, we'll answer if we can, but otherwise we'll probably get back with you on a more technical response. Okay. So again, there's a new general development standards section that does have an exterior lighting section, which is new. And a lighting plan is required for all non-residential uses, mixed use, and multi-unit development. And that is really trying to, it pulls a little bit from some of the dark sky ideas. There's also performance standards in there. It most likely will not apply to residential development. I'm trying to think. So that includes the performance standards and the lighting controls. There's also a flag, we'll also talk about it in the commercial zone. There's a by right conversion of hotels and motels to multi-unit housing. Okay, I've got a few slides on uses and then an example, and then we'll turn it over to residential. Again, trying to move thoroughly, but not, let me know if you need me to slow down. This is intended, this section is a little bit more of a user guide because the zoning ordinance, the draft zoning code, has different types of uses and they're in different areas. So the first of the zone, there's almost two sections of definitions. There's a general definition section on 2.2. So you would look at that and it looks pretty much like we have now, that looks like a list of definitions. If you turn to 923, there's use definitions. So the first one are kind of general, but not a lot on specific uses. So there's two sections. We talked about it when we went through it, and this is their preferred method. They did say some communities end up just combining them into one definition section, but we just wanted to flag if they're kind of looking, and it's a bit confusing that there are two sections there. There's also in the zoning regulations, principal use, accessory use, and temporary use. And this is where we're starting to provide a little bit more clarity. And we're thinking this is a good a way to get around some of the conditional zoning we've had. Principal use is the main use of the land. You can have more than one principal use. So when I look at that 923 section or the use table, you start to think about principal uses. Accessory use is incidental and subordinate to that principal use, and temporary uses generally expire after a time period. So on your use table, they're broken up. Principal use is on that first page, and you have a long series of principal uses. Then on the third page, it switches, the header switches to accessory uses near the bottom. And then on the last page, there's just a few temporary uses mentioned. So it treats those a little bit differently, and we'll give some examples, but to let you know when we're talking about them, we might be switching out between principal, accessory. There's not a lot of temporary uses, so probably won't touch too much on that today. Again, the table of uses is more similar to the form-based code section. P is permitted by right, and I think it's SE is a special exceptions permit for the Board of Zoning Appeals. Again, we have two different types of definitions, and then there's some use standards, and we'll get into that in some examples. So if there are any questions on kind of the use layout, because we'll be talking about that going through residential and the commercial mixed use sections. So we're really starting to pull from a couple different things, and I have an example that it's intended to be helpful. So this is an example for agricultural and horses. So our current zone has an A1 zone. In that A1 zone, there's a revocable special exceptions permit for lots less than 5 acres in the A1 zone. You can get that permit from City Council. There's also a special permit from BOZA for equines for personal use. These were solutions over time to address land use concerns. The new draft has an A1 zone. It's a minimum of 5 acres. There's also uses that are keeping of livestock and farm stands. So you can go to the use table. That use tables could show those are permitted uses in the RN1 zone, RN16 zone, the RN2 zone, and the A1 zone. Both of those have accessory use standards. So we have use standards. We'll be talking about those, and some minimum lot size of 1 acre is required for livestock. So instead of having a special permit for 1 acre for a horse, we are now basically a use standard says you have to have 1 acre. So instead of kind of multiple special permits trying to get at different sizes and scale, it's addressed through uses and use standards. That's a fair assessment. Okay. All right. Anything on those? So when we're talking about uses, we'll try to be pretty consistent, hopefully, on the use table, accessory use standards, but there's just a lot more information in there than we have now, and that's in the layering of it is where hopefully we can get away from conditional zoning and provide more options. So I will turn it over to Brian, and I'll see if I can just.
I'm going to talk about the residential zones, and feel free to stop me if at any point if you have any questions. Same thing with Karen. I'll try to move pretty quickly through this. One thing you noticed on dwellings, we've moved away from single family or the term family in our proposed uses. We're now using units. So dwellings, we have several different versions of dwellings. We have single unit detached, which is a structure containing one dwelling unit located on a single lot. We also have single unit attached. It's a structure containing one single unit dwelling attached at an interior side lot line by a vertical party wall to another single unit dwelling, basically a 2-unit townhome is what that's now called, is a single unit attached. We also have a 2-unit. This is a duplex, a structure containing 2 dwelling units on one lot. Third, we have a 3-unit, which is basically what we call a triplex. It's a structure containing 3 dwelling units on one lot. A quad, what we call quads, are now called 4 units. A structure containing 4 dwelling units on one lot. Townhome, there's nothing changed with that. It's still 3 units or more attached dwellings. That's the same definition we currently have. Multi-unit, the change here is 5 or more dwelling units because it's considered a multifamily apartment or apartment complex. We also have added above the ground floor. Dwelling units located above ground floor non-residential uses, mixed use, if you will. So you can have commercial on the first floor, office, and then above that you can have residential, and that's called above the ground floor residential. We also have live work, a principal structure that combines a dwelling unit with a commercial use permitted. So that's a new use that's being added. And then manufactured home, that's nothing new. We've always had manufacturing definition in the zoning code. And on the screen here, on the left-hand side is the current zones we have in place from R1 to all the way to R5. Proposed new zones are the equivalents on the right-hand side are basically R1s now be broken down into 2 zones, if you will, RN16 and RN15. R2 will now be a new name of RN2. What used to be RT1 will be grouped under RN2T. RTZ will be grouped into RN2T. What used to be R3MD, moderate density, and R3 and R4 special zone, all those will now be grouped in what we call RN3 residential neighborhood zone, and we'll get into what those mean in a second. And then R5 residential zone will now be reclassified as RMH manufactured home zone. So those are the equivalent zones that we already have in the zoning code, and we're also proposing to add 4 new zones, which you don't currently have, which is called traditional neighborhood development zones, and those go from 1 all the way up to 4. So as I mentioned, the R1 zone that we currently have, that's proposed to be slated into 2 different zones, which is RN16 and RN15. The RN16 has a minimum lot size of 6,000 square foot or greater, and that's primarily being used as single-family dwellings. We also have a proposed RN15, which is basically the same single-family or single-unit home, but the lot size is a minimum of 5,000 square foot. So you can see we have a difference of lot sizes in those 2 zones. I think early on we had talked about, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, the RN15 would be primarily used in the urban overlay. Outside the urban overlay, the RN16 will be used outside the suburban part of the city. Chris is giving you a thumbs up. So both those zones, still the primary use of single family dwellings. It just opens up more flexibility in terms of smaller lot sizes in the city of Chattanooga. R2 is going to be, again, the R2 in neighborhood zone. That's a mixture of single-family homes, both attached and detached, and two-family homes. That's similar to what we have now. The R2T, again, is both single-family, attached, and detached, two-family homes and townhomes dwellings. And R3 is basically multifamily, adding that into it. Now, our new zones that we're proposing, this is a change. We're calling those traditional neighborhood development zone. Again, those go all the way from 1 to, I think it's 4. 1, the primary use is single family homes, or single unit homes, I should say, on 5,000 square foot lots or greater. Stepping up to 2, that allows both single unit detached and attached, as well as 2-family, 3-family, and 4-family dwellings. And once you go up to traditional neighborhood development zone 2T, that adds townhome dwellings to the mixture. Stepping it up to TRN3, that adds the same uses, but it also adds multifamily dwellings. And then finally, the TRN4, the only uses that you see in that zone are townhomes and multifamily dwellings. So you can see the range starts from 1 all the way up to 4, and as it goes up, the density increases, or not the density, but the units increases.
A question real quick. I'm looking
Sure.
at the Article 9 use table 9-II, and in the use table it says 2, 3, and 4 unit is allowed in TRN1.
Can somebody check on that? We'll check on that.
And I'm
Thanks.
just confused what's going to control here.
We'll check on that, and also noted that we're back to using family here, so this might be an older version. So yes, thank you.
Yeah, it should be units. I'm not saying, I keep saying family. This should be units here.
Okay.
We'll check on that.
Okay, thank you.
But I'm just going from memory. I was under the impression that the TRN1 was a single unit. But we'll check. Oops. Now, this is the lot size requirements. I'll briefly hit these. This diagram on the bottom is the current zones from RN16 to RN3. You can see the RN1 has for single family, a 6,000 square foot with a minimum lot frontage of 60 foot or average. For the RN15, the minimum lot area is 5,000 square foot. The NR is for non-residential, because non-residential is allowed in those zones, but just I'm focusing primarily on residential. In the RN15, the minimum lot frontage is 50 foot. Then when you go to RN2 to RN3, those lot sizes are the current lot size standards we have in effect today in our current zones, with the exception of multifamily. If you look at the RN3, where it says MU, multi-unit, currently the lot size for multi-unit is 7,500 square foot for the first unit, and then 2,000 for each additional unit above that first. That gets very complicated on how you calculate the density. So the consultants are proposing to do away with that calculation, do just strictly 2,000 square foot for each unit. That's a much easier calculation to determine how many units you can get in R3 zone. That is a substantial change. Any questions on the lot standards here? I'll move on to the same zones we're just talking about. This gets into more of the setbacks. The setbacks for RN1 6 is 25 foot, or the average setback, whichever is less. Then you go from RN15 to RN3, it's a 15 foot front setback, or the average setback, whichever is less. If it's not developed, the front setback is 25 foot. If you can see in the next chart, the interior side setback is 5 foot for all zones, regardless of what zone it is. You go into RN3, it's 5 foot for structures 40 foot or less. For anything over 40 foot, the setback goes up to 10 foot for side setbacks. On the corner side setbacks, that's 20 for all zones. And then a minimum of 25 foot for rear setbacks. Yes.
Yeah, I caught this morning. I think the minimum corner side setback in the draft on Friday is going to reflect the same as the front setback. So we don't have a bigger corner side setback than a front setback. So for 3 of those, it's going to go to 15, or for 4 of them, it's going to go to 15. I think that was just the last minute change.
Okay.
Got one question about this as well. For RN15 to 2T and 3, I'm a little confused why the minimum setback is 15 unless it's not developed, in which it goes up to 25. That seems like a big jump, and seems, I don't know. I'm really confused by that.
We'll have to ask the consultants. But right now, it's the average. If you have two homes on either side, it's the average up to 15 foot. If you have no, get the thing. If the adjacent lots are not developed or vacant, it just goes up to 25 foot, which is like the RN16.
So the way this is written, though, is if you're in an area that's already developed and you've got an average setback of 10 feet, the way I'm reading this is that an RN2 zone, you could have a 10-foot setback because it's whichever is less.
Correct.
But if nothing is developed,
It's 25
you
foot.
go to 25
We'll take a
instead
look
of
at that
15. I'm
list.
just,
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions on the setbacks? Now we're switching to the new trend. We changed these to what's it called? Traditional residential neighborhood. Again, goes from 1 to 4. You see on the screen, lot sizes again are for single unit is 5,000. For single unit attached is 3,750. And then for 2 unit, 3 unit, and 4 units, 7,500 square foot. That's less than what we currently require today. And again, for non-residential, it's 10,000. The minimum lot width in the TRN1 zone is 50 foot, or the average block face, whichever is less. Then single unit attached is 25 per unit, and then non-residential 75. Going up to the next level of TRN2, we're adding multi-unit and townhomes to this classification. The townhouse lot size is 1,350 per unit, and then multi-unit up to 6 is 1,250 square feet per unit. Again, that's a different calculation how we currently handle the number of units in multifamily. Average block face is the same, 50 foot or average, whichever is less. Going up to TRN3, it's the same uses, same lot sizes, with the exception now we've added, we've added multifamily. And 2 units, that's the same. Yes, it's the same. The difference is the minimum lot width. It's changed to 25 foot, where it was 50 in the TRN2.
Hey, Brian,
Yes.
where would 0 lot line homes be built? In TRN3?
Yes. We'll have to check the use table. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, it'd be the TRN3.
So then the minimum interior side setbacks are they 5 for that?
You have 5. I don't know if we.
I just see 5s across the
Yeah.
board, and so I was just thinking about what zone you would suggest for 0 lot line homes. And then we have a lot of developments.
I don't remember we talked about 0 lot line homes in this draft. There's somebody else.
Yeah, it says that we don't have a flag for RZ1. So we
Yeah, I don't think we have.
we'll look for that because it says it doesn't give a 0 interior option. Okay.
Thanks. That's a good point. We'll have to flag that. Any other questions on this one?
I just like too that for the some of the minimum lot areas, we're looking and making sure those are the right numbers. And that's one of the things Hanukkah has been helping with. She calls it stress testing, which I think is a good way to say, what are the numbers in here and what does that look like and what are we getting? So she's been really helpful, and I think we'll have another round on Friday. But just so you know that we're really digging down on like the 7,500 square feet for a 2 unit. How available is that in the urban area in the city of Chattanooga? There's not a lot. So those are a couple of things that we're looking at. She's kind of running the numbers and doing some just kind of build out of lots. So just flagging that. But if we have a change before the next ordinance, we'll flag that for you too.
And this chart is in the draft. That's why we're pulling directly from that. So we got to cross check all the numbers and everything, make sure that's still accurate.
Backing up to the residential zone dimensional standards, which is,
This one here.
yeah. No, just whereas,
Back one more.
That one there.
yeah, so RN1, 6 through RN3, the TH is for townhomes, right?
Correct.
So that's the minimum lot width is 24.
It's supposed to be 15. We changed that to 15, and I think it was intended to be across the ordinance for townhomes. And we've got to change some places, but yes, we flagged that it's not changed all the places, and Emily saw a typo too. So yes, townhomes are supposed to be 15 feet across the ordinance. Does that Does that sound right?
And then you would have to adjust the minimum lot area as well. You
Okay.
know, because I mean, if it's 15, I mean, if you took 1350 divided by 15 means that is then requiring the lot depth to be 90.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which it's not. More often than not, it might be only 45 or 40. You could look at some townhome developments and see that that lot area would also be needing to be adjusted.
Great. So we'll do that. And I made a note, but that's something, yes. And that's the type of thing we're trying to look at. Of when we tweak one, what does that leave it with the rest, particularly now that we've got kind of the draft where it is. We're going back and making sure that the dimensions still all make sense. So thank you. So the recommendation is maybe looking at 45 feet or 40 or 45 feet, but we'll look and see what's out there.
I've got a couple questions about this as well. RN2, 2T, and 3. In my mind, we're moving up the chain. We're trying to get more dense. We're trying to have more units per acre, but the front lot width jumped. We had it down to 50 for the RN15, and then it jumped back up to 60. I'm just wondering if we can keep that consistent, especially as we look to the future, people trying to rezone. If something's an R15 now, but they want to build duplex.
I think
Make sure that
It's
conforming
60 foot
throughout.
or the average. So if you have average, could be less than that.
But you're thinking
But you think it's 60
by
still.
right 50 feet.
By
I think
right
that's
50
one
feet.
of the ones on our list to look at. Was
Okay.
that?
And then the other question I have is just lot sizes in general. I know you guys were talking about stress testing, and I want to make sure that some of our historic neighborhoods are included in that stress testing, comparing these to St. Elmo, Ferger Place, Jefferson Heights, places where we historically have much smaller lots by right, and making sure that there's a zone where those places can fit back into later on. Because I have neighbors who they're not on a lot of record anymore for whatever reason, but there's no zone to fit a historic house that is in the context of a historic neighborhood.
We will. Thank you.
Any other questions on this chart here before I go to the next one?
Hold up on this statement there, that we're talking about the historical, where you got the chart on the setbacks. And is that chart gonna remain go away?
Talking about the current lot of record setbacks.
Yes,
No, that would be replaced. I think that's going to be replaced with new setbacks.
it's gonna be replaced.
Yes, that's when you're talking about now the current zoning code. Yes.
Okay, thank
In the lot of record, I'm trying to find it in the ordinance. The lot of record is, let's see if I have that, it's changing. Let's see if I can find it real quick. I'll come back to that.
Yeah,
if
this
you're-
draft's still new to us, trying to find anything is hard and difficult. So, any other questions on this, on the RN1 zones? Talked about those. And then back on this chart here for the traditional residential neighborhood zones, on the TRN4, you see the townhome and multi-unit square footage has gone down. For an RN3, it's 1250 for multifamily. It's 950 for multifamily. For townhomes, it's 1350 in the RN3. It goes down to 1100 in the TRN4. The frontage requirements or minimum lot width, if you will, is reduced for actually the same for minimum lot width. It's just the square footage has changed. Questions on this before I go on next slide?
Hey, Brian, I think you might have already covered the slide, but the table 4.2, is that where you're going next? Or have you already
Yeah,
covered that?
no, I don't think it's in there.
I think it's in there.
That's the building height one.
Yeah, we've got 35 feet on TRN1 through TRN4. We have a lot of developments that I would think would be TRN4 scattered around Chattanooga that are now pushing 4 stories for residential.
Correct me, is it the high, isn't it only within 100 feet?
It talks about, it's the maximum height of, this is to answer Brian's question. The maximum height of a structure is limited to 35 feet within 100 feet of an R16, RN15, RN2, RN2T.
So if you're within 100 feet, you got the height requirement. I believe outside that, you can go taller. It's almost like a transition buffer zone.
Urban
yeah,
properties.
but you're saying like for the UGCs that we're using as
Yeah,
residential.
like I'm thinking about some of that stuff that's being built on St. Elmo Avenue now, down on the south broad side of St. Elmo Avenue. That's 4 stories.
Are they mixed use or fully residential?
They look like townhomes.
Okay, so we'll double check on
And they're
them.
4 stories, and then I think we have a lot of that on that Main Street south side area where Chris Henniger's
Yeah, all
redeveloping
that,
a lot over there, and that's
Townhome developments through
Yeah,
there.
we don't have any 4-story product, but we see a lot of it, and I'm assuming it's UGC right now, which I'm
I think it's
thinking
UGC.
would be TRN.
Okay.
Or what zone would that be if it wasn't TRN 4?
The TRN zone would be probably UGC. I would think it would take
UGC.
some of the place of UGC residential only. I would think so, but we can look at that.
Or the TRN4 when those
Yeah.
become that.
So you're thinking not 35 feet, but something to accommodate 4 stories.
I would think so if you're
Okay.
trying to mirror it after UGC and how that's being used in some of those urban contexts
Okay.
anyways. And the 100-foot setback is going to be a real issue in those urban conditions too.
Sure.
We did, because one of the things we looked at was how do we handle a transitional zone? And there are some places when we get to the commercial mixed use where there is very little transition to a residential zone. You can go, I think it's a CMU 2, you can do an 85-foot tall building, only 25 feet from a residential zone. This was the solution that Camiris recommended, which was to have some transition. But part of that we're going to have to figure out in mapping is where these are sitting and how close they are to a residential zone.
I had a question about uses. I know you guys kind of explained this at the beginning, but it's already escaped me. Can you explain again the difference between a single unit attached versus a 2-unit versus a townhouse? Those all seem.
I know. We staff struggled with that as well early on. The single unit detached is typical single family.
Right.
Yeah. Single unit attached, as it was called, single unit attached, that's just a 2-unit townhouse.
2-unit. Is there any reason to not just move single unit attached into townhouses and just define townhouses differently? I know in the definition you showed earlier, townhouses start at 3 units.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, just to simplify things.
Yeah, many years ago, we
Right. I would call that a townhouse. Even if it's just 2, I'd still call it a townhouse. That's just me.
Is it in reference to the accessory dwelling unit that would be allowed?
no,
No, because it's single family
That's
the
Detached.
single family detached.
But we can look at,
Like the lot line.
yeah.
So if you get a lot line running down the middle of 2 townhomes, that's where you can see the tax. You've got all the same lot.
So we can look at, is there a reason to keep, what is the reason? to
It
keep
just seems like
two-family
single
townhomes,
unit
2-unit
attached is such a
townhomes? Yeah.
narrow and almost barely used form that I wonder why we just don't roll it into townhouses.
Well, and I
But
think-
there might be a reason for it.
What we get, just going from history here, many years ago, we never had a definition of townhome required 3 units. It could be 2 units. There was some opposition out there. The 2-unit townhome looked like a duplex. And we amended the zoning code many years ago. And we get a lot of requests for somebody wanting to do it just a 2-unit townhome. You cannot do that in our current zone. You have to have at least 3 or more. So we amended the R2 zone many years ago to allow, I guess about 3 years ago, to allow a 2-unit townhome in the R2 zone. And I don't know if they're just carrying that over because we already have that in our current zones.
I'm looking at the use table, and the only zone where a townhouse is allowed and a duplex is not is the TRN 4, and then some of the mixed use areas. So I mean, maybe there's a
Yeah.
reason
Is
for
there
it,
a
but it just
tool?
seems
Which
a
tool would
very
it be?
narrow definition, and I'd like to remove as much clutter as we can.
Okay, we'll take a look at that. Any other questions on this chart in front of before we move on? This gets into the setbacks, similar to what we talked about a minute ago. These setbacks are 5 foot on the interior. These zones for the traditional residential neighborhood talk about build-to zones instead of traditional setbacks. The TRN1 all the way up to the 3, it's the average setback. The adjacent lots plus or minus 5 feet. Then it's 15 feet plus or minus 5 feet if there's no adjacent structures. Side setbacks again are 5 feet. Corner side setbacks are 10 foot. I don't know if this is something that we're still addressing too, Chris, that you mentioned earlier. These are 10 on the corner. So something we'll need to look at. Yes. And rear setback is 10 foot. So you can see these setbacks are more what you'd see in traditional urban settings. Any questions on the setbacks? Again, as Karen mentioned earlier, we do have a proposal of, they call them design standards, not really design standards or development form standards. So I'll go through those quickly. These are principal use standards for single unit detached and single unit attached, or 2 unit, which is a duplex. These dwellings must have these following requirements.
And they start on 9.6.
9.6.
in your ordinance. So again, these are under the uses, principal uses section, and that's just a cut and paste from starting on 9.6.
Yeah. So dwelling must have a primary entrance from a facade facing the street. The front entry must be the dominant feature on the front elevation of a home and an integral part of the structure, using features such as porches, raised steps and stoops, or decorative railings to articulate the front facade. On a corner lot, only one facade facing the street requires a primary entrance. Number 2, windows, entrances, porches, and other architectural features are required in all street-facing facades to avoid the appearance of blank walls. As a minimum 10% transparency requirement applies to all facade facing a street and is calculated based on the entire facade. Front-loaded attached garage cannot project beyond the building facade line. This applies to garages that take access or load from the front line or corner side lot line. And a front-loaded detached garage must be set back a minimum 20 feet from the lot line that the garage is accessed from. I think we got rid of that, did we not?
No, we changed the width.
Width, okay.
Yes.
So Brian, in number 1, I feel like that's a direct. So when I was driving around with some of the consultants, one day they noticed a development in my district where the primary entrance door is tucked away deep behind or along the side of the garage, almost to where you can only see it if you're standing in front of the house. Is this kind of a direct response to that type of design?
Right.
Because it was not received well by some of the folks that I was with. Would that be pretty accurate?
I would say that's
I say so.
accurate.
As you see, these are not, again, they're not really design standards. It's not saying you have to have all brick or all vinyl or anything like that. It's just saying these are more form, if you will, standards. Yeah, it's form standards.
So I've got a question about number 1, and this is something we've run into in form-based code several times, is developers building kind of courtyard facing townhomes or single family houses or something where they all share this nice park space. And maybe the park space opens onto the street, but all the houses are facing interior. And I'm wondering if there's any way
We
to
have,
accommodate that sort of.
I don't think it's in the slides, but we do have a cottage court design or standards in there that would address situations such as you're talking about. I don't think we're talking about it today.
Right, and that came up during the form-based code, right? In the same issue.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll just flag that one for when the homes face a courtyard or shared space.
Yeah. You know, the questions on these that apply to single unit detached, because we also have standards for 3 unit, 4 unit, and multi-unit townhouses. These are a little more in depth. Facades must be designed with consistent materials that wrap around all facades. There must be a unifying architectural theme for the entire 3 unit, 4 unit, and multi-unit townhomes. Utilizing a common vocabulary of architectural form, elements, materials, and colors in the entire structure. It's a lot. Street-facing building facades must include windows, projected or recessed entrances, overhangs, and other architectural features. 3-dimensional elements such as balconies and bay windows are encouraged to provide dimensional elements on facade. It also has transparency requirements, depending on the street the facade faces. Townhomes 10%, a 3-unit, 4-unit, a multi-unit is 15%. The following it does.
Sorry, I've got a couple questions about one. consistent materials that wrap around all facades, how many materials is included in that plural word? And who is enforcing this is just as important as anything else. Because
The LDO would be the ones enforcing, but we've had the same discussion. What's it mean consistent? What's architectural theme mean? So we'll take note of that.
Right. We talked about it this morning, and I think we discussed it with the LDO, and they felt that it was enforceable, but there's not much guidance to that. So yes, we'll flag it.
Leaves up to that staff member to make that decision at times. That answer it, I guess.
I would be concerned about the tendency of field representatives to differ from the plans reviews and how the enforcement of that could ultimately come out and be extreme.
Yes.
Yes. We got that noted. We'll take a look at it. Any other questions on?
I have a question. It's more of a generalized question, not a home builder, so not sure if there is an impact, but do these design standards have an impact on cost and affordability for the houses that are being built?
I'll defer to developer on that. I don't know if it impacts the cost, not maybe Dan or somebody else would have an idea of what the impact of these would be on construction cost.
Expect if we did a survey, we'd find 90-something% of all single-family units that we've permitted in the last however many years met all these standards. I don't think I think it's going to be a very few, but I mean, we can do that. We can try to do some kind of survey to see what, I think this is really trying to deal with the outliers. But I mean, I think that would be one way to handle it, just to look and see, let's pick 200 homes that have been permitted and whatever number and try to see if any of these things would have been triggered.
Yeah.
Because
I think the plain concrete block would be.
But these standards here on the screen now only apply to 3-unit, 4-unit, and multi-unit. It doesn't townhomes. Doesn't apply to the single-family detached. Single-family detached were these standards here. It just says have a primary entrance from a facade facing the street, windows, entrance, and porches, and transparency requirements. It doesn't get into certain types or regulated materials in terms of concrete or anything. This only applies to the 3 and above. That help answer some of the questions, maybe.
For B, building materials limited to 25% of each facade. Is this one of these 4? Somebody could be tricky and try and say, okay, I'm going to do 25% corrugated metal and 25% vinyl right next to each other on the same wall.
We'll have to check the consultant and see what their intent was. I can see where you're coming from. That could be 25% of each one. But any other questions on that slide?
There aren't currently multi-unit apartment complexes where they're all vinyl siding being permitted and built.
Probably so.
There are.
I would assume so. Yeah, this is the new proposed standards.
Okay.
But I've
The
assumed,
new
yeah,
standards would say they could not be all vinyl siding.
correct.
Well, then that would affect cost of construction and affordability. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know where that is. We don't use a whole lot of vinyl, but I'm pretty certain that there are residential developments in the city where they're all vinyl. Okay. And so vinyl is some sort of chemical composite of plastics. So that seems to me to be, I mean, what is vinyl? I guess I don't understand what vinyl is. I mean, I know what everybody thinks vinyl is, but when it becomes law, I don't know what vinyl is. Okay. So it could be theoretically rubber. It just couldn't be vinyl. Just sure the vinyl siding industry would have like a workaround for that. It's not plastic. Okay. I just didn't know how clear that was in terms of the code.
It's cool. Any other questions on that slide? Move on. There are some additional standards for residential zones. Most of that's dealing with accessory structures. It does talk about parking and landscaping. This is Article 12. Article 11 is the accessory structure standards, and Article 13 is landscape buffering. I don't think there's anything new that's in there that we've already talked about. One of the bigger changes is the planned unit developments that I need to go through. This is found in section 16.6 or on page 16.7 of your book. There's a new PUD process. The intent behind the new PUD is to encourage and allow more creative and flexible developments of land that is possible under district zoning regulations that should only be applied to further those applications that provide compensating amenities to the city. The PUD will no longer be used solely as a tool for setback and lot frontage reductions. The intent is to ease the strict application of zoning standards in exchange for public benefit or creative development. Approval of a planned unit development includes a pre-application process with RPA. You can also submit an optional concept plan review to the Planning Commission. There is no public hearing on that other than outside advertising the Planning Commission meeting. There's no vote on the concept plan. The Planning Commission can give guidance on that plan. Then finally, you submit a development plan for approval by the Planning Commission and ultimately City Council. An application will be required to demonstrate enhanced design and amenities that will carry through the review and approval process. Additional uses not allowed in the underlying zoning are allowed through the PUD process. The PUD's allowed in any zone, but the underlying zoning controls those uses. Now, if you do a PUD through this process, comes to the Planning Commission and City Council, as part of that PUD process, additional uses can be permitted, even though the underlying zone may not allow those. Here's on the screen here. A planned unit development may allow uses that are currently not allowed in the zone if such uses enhance the overall concept of the PUD and meet the expectation standards. Within the zone, you'll see there's 4 or 5 criteria that you have to meet if you want to say you're doing an R1 PUD. You want to mix it with townhomes or single family or multifamily. There's additional criteria that you have to meet to be able to have that PUD approval through the Planning Commission and City Council. The recommendation of the Planning Commission decision of City Council must make a finding that the standards for a PUD have generally been met. Again, those are spelled out in the book in front of you. There are some administrative modifications that are allowed by LDO. If the LDO director feels those are modifications have been determined to be minor in modifications. If they're substantial, they must come back through like you normally would see for major modifications. So the PUD, I think Councilman Leffer, you got a question? In the PUD, it's a PUD process. This is changing that. So if you're in the R1 zone, ideally you would not be. In which sense?
So this is exceptions from zone regulations. 16.7 This is just to clarify, but probably not completely answer. A planned unit development may allow uses that are currently not allowed in the zone if such uses enhance the overall concept of the PUD and meet the standards. So when we talked about this with Camiros, the PUD is intended to be a tool, right? A tool for development and allow creative and flexible design. So the idea was, and I'm going to give an example of a small coffee shop is part of a residential development. That's just an example of where it is. It's a very small part of it. It tends to, it's not allowed in the zone, but it might enhance the overall plan.
Therefore, you're not having to rezone part of that property for commercial use to put that coffee shop in.
I think the process is intended to have, right.
Ideally, because we have so many different flexibility in residential zones, you really wouldn't see many PUDs anymore. I would think moving forward, if this was adopted, the PUDs you would see would be something like Chestnut Street, Wheeling Foundry site, where you have large sites that are coming. There's a mixture of zones. Still have to have 20 different zones. Yeah.
And I think the intention, this is one of those we mentioned there's a different process. There is a pre-application consultant, and then you can have an optional concept plan review. I think the intention is to get away from on the fly something being presented at council. So this is one that would be new. I think this would be one we would have to track and just see how it's used. Because we kind of had a little bit of the same reaction about how would that work. But I think it's intended to be a tool that people do want to use for being creative versus maybe, we see a lot of residential development or single family residence. This is intended to really be a creative
It's
tool.
a big shift from what the PUDs we're using now. The PUDs we're getting now are not truly PUDs. So this is a whole new mindset.
This is going back to the way a PUD was supposed to be used when it was created 25 years ago. We had a number of C3s and other things in the last 2 years that I've suggested they be PUDs, and they're like, oh, we don't want to be a PUD because LDO will, I don't know, this theory that LDO hates PUDs. But hopefully this is trying to make it so it's, again, you could come in with something completely unique and go through a process of getting that approved with all kinds of different units and different configurations and retail and whatever.
There's criteria in your, it's not on the screen today, there's criteria in there that you have to meet those 4 or 5 criteria. It won't be just a simple, if you will, blanket approval PUDs.
Just to clarify a few things. Is there a minimum size for a PUD anymore under this draft?
I don't believe so.
Is there any underlying zone that can or cannot be put into a PUD?
PUDs, I believe, Karen, check me. I think PUDs are allowed in any zone except form-based code.
I agree. I do think that's the case, but we'll confirm.
Yes.
I thought there was a minimum.
So this is almost,
It says, sorry, just to confirm, I'm confirming. A PUD is authorized in all zones with the exception of the form-based code zones. To be clear, PUDs are not permitted in form-based code zones.
Is there any lot size?
I
don't remember seeing a lot
I didn't
size.
see any. I just wanted to make sure, and I wanted that out loud.
Yes.
The way I'm conceptualizing this is almost just a build it yourself zone. If there's, and
So-
it'll have to go through
Yes.
the whole process of, is this appropriate for the area?
Yes, because the
Because
underlying,
the underlying zone, if you can add uses, the underlying zone almost.
well, your underlying zoning still controls the uses and your dimensional standards. Now, if you come in and do a PUD and you meet those 4 or 5 criteria of why you want to add commercial or why you want to do different setbacks, that would be approved by the planning commission and ultimately city council. So
Right.
basically, yes, you're right. It's creating your own zone.
Density? Can you increase density?
I don't remember if density is listed at all.
It's really not much different than creating your own form-based code
Right,
district.
that's what
is
I'm getting at.
We've done
It's the same, basically.
in the last 2 months with both of our form-based code districts. They just created a new district.
Right.
The same-
This would be something I'd see the
This
BN
is
do.
something you could do outside of the form-based, but do similar.
That one last question, can you increase the density?
I
of the PUD?
don't
We'll
recall
have
on
to
that, or
I'm
check
not
on that.
sure.
I don't recall.
And one of the things I'll note is that, and I'm looking at 16A, number 3, it talks about underlying zone dimensional design and use regulations apply unless an exception is granted. Skipping down, to be granted such exceptions, the applicant must demonstrate enhanced design and amenities. In no case may an exception to zone regulations be granted unless the applicant demonstrates such enhanced design. So, and then I believe later on, it talks about documenting that that's part of the review,
Right.
is the enhanced design. So the must should be the same as the shall, but it's intended. And then enhanced design and design characteristics and amenities include gathering space, use of sustainable design, preservation of existing environmental features. Those are intended to be part of the review.
It's got a whole review criteria. in
I
there,
just want to go on the
because-
record and say I think it was an awesome idea. I think it'll really unleash the creativity of our developers here in Chattanooga, hopefully to good effect. But it does depend a lot on how much we trust the appointed members here and the elected members of the city council to actually follow through with this. I think it's awesome. I trust everybody here. I trust city council, but that's really where it's going to come down to. It's not a checklist anymore.
Correct. I believe that's it on the PUDs. We'll turn it over to Karen for the commercial.
Okay.
Unless there's any other question on the residential, the PUDs.
And then Mr. Chair probably will take a lot of the remainder of the time. Is that okay? Or I can move quickly if you'd like to reserve any time at the end for questions, comments by planning commissioners. Okay. So mixed use and commercial zones, you have there is it's part of your handout, kind of the overall handout, so I won't read. I think of interest is UGC, and I think based on the question previously, I think we probably need to parse maybe UGC residential only that are being used 4 stories, and then UGC that have that commercial component. So we're switching to a UGC shown on the screen that would have a commercial component listed. There are a lot of UGCs out there that have been conditioned to residential use only. So in the next rendition of a presentation, we probably need to be a little bit more clear on that. I won't read you this rundown either. I'll note that the CNT neighborhood transition commercial zone is intended to transition between neighborhoods and higher intensity commercial areas. This is one that kind of came out of our discussion process. This is a tool we've used for on East Brainerd Road between Brainerd Road and Brainerd Hills. We've used it on Miller Drive, which is a road between the parallels the interstate, I guess, between Spring Creek
And Eastgate Mall.
Eastgate. So we have a transitional zone we've been using as a tool. We've been doing that through a lot of conditions. We have a zone that's intended to serve that use now. C5 neighborhood commercial zone that's generally located within neighborhoods, and we'll look at a tool about how we're quickly broadening commercial over time, a lot of spot zoning and what a neighborhood commercial piece looks like. The CTMU, transitional mixed-use commercial zone, is it's also a transition, but it's a little bit more intensely used. The commercial corridor zone is a little bit more like the C2, and then the regional commercial zone is kind of that C2, C4. So retail centers, larger retail centers, do not have an IKEA coming. Should have used another example. Auto dealers, again, I think the mall would be under this regional commercial zone. And then the CMU commercial mixed-use zones are for highlight their traditional urban mixed-use development. And I think as we go through, they generally have a few more standards, but again, those are intended to be mixed-use development. So I guess I'm kind of thinking about it transitioning a little bit to form-based code, but more, but not there yet. So, and those have different. There's a CMU 1 and 2, and you'll see as we go through, they have some different standards for each. So I spent a little bit more time on some of the uses for commercial. I'm happy to, you can go through the standards, but the intention is, again, CNT is that neighborhood transition. You do see a minimum lot area. It's intended to be a reuse of residential structures, really. You can introduce some new uses there. And then the CMU2, no minimum lot area. And really that CMU2 is a really wide open zone with uses and building dimensions. Because I mentioned it and got a smile from our council rep, I'll highlight at the bottom of the slide. It does note for hotel motel uses that have been converted to multi-unit dwellings, the minimum lot area per dwelling does not apply. Staff had drafted a proposal, planning commission moved forward several months ago now, a proposal that would allow hotel motel conversions to multifamily. We felt that was an affordable housing tool. And that did not move forward to council. So we are flagging this to be clear for our council representatives that this is in here. There is a flag for that, and that is not part of the minimum lot area. Also, minimum lot areas does apply to institutional uses since those are all allowed in the zone. Just moving forward. Again, this is height. And this is similar language to the for the residential, and talking about height. It's near a residential zone. It limits the height of the structure. So CMU2 is 85 feet. Then a residential zone, it would be reduced to 40 feet for that 100-foot distance. But that's intended to allow. I think of this as like a commercial and urban corridor or an urban area where we want a lot of height. We have that first floor of a multi-story building is a minimum of 14 feet tall or 14 feet, but it does have that trigger for when it is near a residential zone. I think that's one of the things in mapping again we're going to have to look at. I think when we went through, we're thinking there's not going to be a lot of places where you have a CMU zone of 85 feet with all that intensity next to residential. But that's something we'll keep an eye on. Some additional changes, and I think we're going to go through these, so probably won't get those too far. There are mixed use and commercial design standards. Some exemptions for that are additions in the commercial neighborhood and neighborhood transition zones. The intention is to not put an additional, ideally a lot of those are keeping a residential feel, so design standards will not apply to those, or conversion of single unit dwellings to non-residential live work. It's something that that is intended probably to keep the residential feel. So again, I'm going to move quickly through these because we have a couple other examples to get to. This is design standards related to orientation, facade design, and roof design. And looking at this, the CNT, which is that lower density neighborhood transition zone, none of these apply to that. As you get to closer to the CMU2, which is that taller, more dense, you see a lot of the standards starting to apply. And I think these, again, they say design standards. They're probably also maybe considered development standards. It's talking about breaking up building facades. It's talking about entrance location. So, anyone has any questions? Also mentioned roof design is at the bottom. It mentions green roofs, blue roofs, and white roofs. Again, in trying to bring the code up to more current standards. I think everyone's aware of a green roof. Blue roof is related to stormwater, and white roofs are related to like solar reflectivity to keep the building cooler. And there are definitions related to those. That's intended to help us meet some of our more sustainable guidelines. Anything on that? know that is a lot of information. Again, trying to just give you the scale of it. I wanted to highlight two use standards. And this is one of the things that we were pretty pleased to see in here was a neighborhood commercial establishment. So that's where we often see a lot of conditions. So someone wants to put in a small salon, small restaurant, putting in a commercial zone, a lot of times would be a full range of standards. So this is a use example, with section 910. And this is where if the zone allows the use of neighborhood commercial, these are all the standards that go with it. So these are things that might have been previously conditions, but in order to get away from conditions and just to have real clear standards that apply to every use case, this is what it is. And just to highlight, they're allowed in existing structures that are non-residential or mixed use prior to the effective date of this code. So the intention is if it's been historically used for that, we want to allow that use again. It allows permitted uses of pretty low intensity, daycares, offices, personal service establishments. There's no sale of alcohol, but it does allow eating and drinking establishments. No additional off-street parking is required. The idea is that allowing a reuse of an older historic non-residential building and then requiring them to put in a lot of parking is a mismatch. So no additional parking is required, but if you have it current, you must maintain it. Drive-through facilities are prohibited and outdoor sports are prohibited, and signs are limited. So again, we really found this when we want to introduce neighborhood commercial establishments. We thought this is a really good tool to do this. Is something we don't have now. The second use.
Can you explain real quick
Yes.
why are we limiting this to existing non-residential structures? Is this a zone or is this a use?
This is a use.
Okay.
So I go back to the zone, but the idea was if you have, in our communities, we have historic structures that would be used, they're not used for residential. You can bring them back online.
Got it. Okay.
So if I wanted to convert a house to a office or something, I would probably be looking at a neighborhood commercial or transitional zone of some sort. This is intended to really allow those that are non-residential structures that are already out there to bring them back online.
Feel like the wood shop, I think it's called in San Elmo, a couple of those little old buildings like that, they come back online without going through rezoning.
This is also kind of helping with the complete communities with the idea that there are services in closer proximity. Another use example, again, thinking about uses, or at least I was thinking a little bit more about uses for a commercial zone and how this code is used. This is just an example for the CR regional commercial zone. That's more kind of that C2 to C4 zone. If principal uses, remember you can have multiple principal uses, retail goods, so as an example, retail goods, self-storage facility. Retail goods does not have a principal use standard. There's no additional language to require that. Self-storage facility does have something if it's enclosed. There's some additional standards. So again, getting away from conditions or just set standards for those things, because a lot of times, and I think self-storage facility standards are like screening of the storage area. Some of these have just one item as a standard. Some of them are a little bit more complex. But again, storage is something that often gets conditions. If it's so just an example. And also, there's accessory uses. Remember, we have principal uses, accessory, temporary uses. If I wanted to do a drive-through facility in this example, there are additional standards for drive-throughs. Drive-throughs are another item that get a lot of conditions, and there's a whole section on drive-throughs again to get away from every time we look at a drive-through, we're putting conditions on that. So in this example, I'd be looking at the different type of uses. Some of them will have additional standards, and some of them are not. That's kind of how the new code is used. I'll just move quickly because I think we're getting close to time. We have some special purpose zones, so those that are neither residential nor commercial. We do have a couple new zones. Overall, there's not very much change or any change really besides some minor updates till airport, floodway, aviation, and level field. Those are pretty set. The A1 zone, we've highlighted 2 new zones. We have an open space zone, which we've never had before. That's really our open space public recreational facilities instead of having a commercial park be zoned 40 acres in a commercial zone. The idea would be to be an open space zone. And cultural facilities, performance venues, just highlighting those are a little bit of an outlier. And also an institutional zone, that's government uses. This is to take place of the institutional PUD. So lately, we had a Macaulay institutional PUD change. We have an institutional PUD coming up on the Commission's agenda this month. So these are intended, instead of those being PUDs, and then having to amend the zone, and then add the PUD, it's intended to be a zone. You can get away from the PUDs. Just quickly, there's not a lot of change. There is not intended, and there doesn't appear to be a lot of change for the industrial zone. We kind of combined M2 and M3, which was light industrial and warehousing and wholesaling. We never used the warehousing and wholesaling zone a lot. It's just uses are so limited. The M1 zone pretty much remains the same. I'm sorry, there's a typo there. The extraction zone, there's maybe another term for that. That is mining and outdoor uses. So quarries are the ones public paying efficiencies most often. And then the new zone is industrial mixed use zone. And this is intended to be older structures that aren't suitable for industrial, but they can have a wide variety of uses. So this is something I think we've needed for a while. Residential uses are allowed in that. And so the industrial mixed use zone, I'm sorry, this is the industrial mixed use zone. It has development standards related to orientation, facade design, roof design, and building materials. The other zones pretty much all have the same language, but the industrial mixed use zone is really a tool to redevelop older industrial areas and buildings and allow those residential and mixed uses. And I think that is all we have for today. So,
Can you talk about cottage courts?
yes, the cottage courts are on, they are a use specification, and they are on page
9-5.
So this is one that's, it can be on your own. This is, I think, in Pine County.
Is this where you're contemplating HPRs going?
This is where we talked about HPR.
Yes.
So we had a call with our chairman to make sure we were thinking about how HPRs were working and what would someone do at cottage court if they could do an HPR. So the cottage court standards, you can see that they are permitted. You can look at the table of their use limitations that are permitted in certain zones. So not a rezoning to an R3 zone and doing an HPR to enable that to happen. Allowing some of those that are permitted by right. You can also just do them on individual lots. So I think that's one of the concerns we first went through with Camiras was why would you do it if you could do an HPR? You can do individual lots for these cottage courts. So, and then the maximum number of buildings is 10. One of the things we talked about originally, that the number was higher, but if they intend to be integrated into it's a good number. They can be integrated. Once you get to 30, you put a project with 30 next to another one with 30, the compatibility might start to be lost. So right now, the number of buildings within a project is 10.
Can y'all check and see if state law allows you to require B? That comes up currently through LDO. And
Which say,
the item B,
I
the
see.
HOA or the property management, I think that comes up currently in LDO where they ask to see some HPR documents, which are private access, ingress, easement documents that are all governed privately. That would be no different than I think, no different than a Publix coming in and applying for a rezoning and asking for their corporate documents and who their shareholders are and that sort of thing.
Would it make sense?
I don't think you're allowed to govern that.
If they're on individual lots, would it make sense to have just the HOA, but when it's designed as a multi-dwelling development, make a distinction there, if you think it makes sense for, that it doesn't make sense for either of those options?
I don't know. I mean, I just don't think it's, I don't know. I don't know how it works. I just think you should ask the attorney, can you actually ask for that level of, or even require that level of documentation?
So you're saying like when there's common ownership of anything, it could be a subdivision with a detention pond that.
Well, in the
City-
case of a detention pond, we have to do an I&M agreement. So that's an agreement between the developer and the city. This is, what's happening is we're going to do an HPR development, or not even, we're going to put 10 houses on one lot. And LDO says, we want to see your HPR documents. Well, that's a private document. That's not public. It shouldn't be.
We'll definitely ask that.
So maybe you just have an I&M agreement, which is set up and then the developer signs the I&M agreement for stormwater currently, but signs in the capacity as president of the HOA, you know? So that may be a way to get around it.
And it could be, what is the purpose of that document?
Well, that's-
Some documentation that perhaps is chosen by the.
I would assume that's the reason the city's asking you. They just want to understand maintenance responsibilities in the future. We did let CNE look at some early, sort of just general information about this, and they did give us some feedback, I think, on cottage courts and a couple other things. They did ask for us to find a place to put a 10-plex, because they have one that they've been considering a design, which would, I guess, be 10 studio units in one building that's about, it looks like a large house. And I don't know that we've actually figured out where to put that yet, but I think, I mean, again, I'm suspecting we'll get other. I didn't hear you.
Record in Riverview.
Yeah. Agreed.
I've got some questions about the townhouses in particular. We've got the R2 zone and we've got the R2T zone, and then we've got the TR1 zone and the TRN2 zone. And in a lot of cases, especially in the R2, R2T, the only difference that I can see is that one allows townhouses and the other doesn't. And when you're already allowing duplexes and triplexes, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that we're creating a whole new zone just to add townhouses as an improved use. I don't see them as being any more or any less desirable than a duplex or a triplex. So I'm wondering if those can just be combined and we just have one R2 zone.
So you're talking about the RN2 versus the RN2T,
Yes, I'm still looking at the old.
those zones.
And I guess it's a little bit related to the duplex versus single unit attached.
It's related to that,
triplex
but
versus a
it's a
townhouse.
little different. Okay, so RN2 and RN2T, you've got all the lot standards are the same, all of the setbacks look to be the same, and so I'm just wondering why townhouses are singled out as being important enough to regulate separately that we couldn't just put them all in one zone.
I can answer one of those. So for the RN, let me make sure I've got the right one. For the RN2, two townhomes would be allowed there. They're just called something different. It'd be single unit attached. Is that correct? Two townhomes
Two
would still be
townhomes,
allowed
single
there.
unit
That's my
attached.
understanding.
TR2, it's just that 3 or more would not be.
Well, one possibility is we made some changes to the townhome, so it could have been we come back, we've done, we've collapsed them, so we can go back and look at that.
On 9-22, table 10.1. So I guess what you're saying sort of makes sense for the difference between the RN2 and the RN2T, where the townhouse kind of falls under the single unit attached and all that. I still don't see them as deserving of that extra layer of scrutiny. I just think that could all be rolled into one zone pretty easily. And then especially the TRN1 versus TRN2, the only difference is that, well, okay, TRN2 allows multifamily up to a maximum of 6 units. So that's more understandable. I'd just like to take a look at that. Again, trying to condense things down as much as possible.
Well, massing too, I think Emily, my note is that are three townhomes compatible with some places where larger, more, because I don't think there is a maximum number of townhomes you can connect.
Oh, the old zone does. I'm not sure
Yeah.
about the new zone.
So that might be one where it's related also to massing, so we can take a look at that.
And on the townhomes, if you jump down to the commercial uses where the townhomes are also acceptable, it does seem strange to me that you could put townhomes where you could put an IKEA, but you couldn't put townhomes where it would make sense to, sort of transition from detached single family density to more of like a developing corridor. I see that it's in the CC, but it just seems like the CTMU might be another place where that like next step up of density could serve as a transitional piece between, single family residential and in a corridor or a neighborhood center or a neighborhood area that's trying to get some redevelopment investment. Townhomes is a pretty good place.
Those
to
are
do
good
that.
comments.
And we originally did not have it. I think the consultants did not have it in CR, and we really said, I think they were limited in the amount of residential they had in the CR. And we basically said, if we can build out our commercial with, at other residential, we'd want to take advantage of that. So I think we had put that in, but we probably didn't look at the other spectrum. So thank you. Yeah, we'll take a look at that. Because that originally wasn't there. Townhomes weren't.
Similar on these transitional commercial zones, CNT and CN, it seems to me like that would be a perfect place for both above the ground floor dwelling and live work units. If you've got an attorney's office in the front and the attorney lives in the back or above, that's pretty unobtrusive use for that. Seems like it's meeting that transitional character of CNT or CN.
Looking at, that's a CN, and then the C.
CNT.
Yeah, thank you.
So Nathan, you're advocating for business in the front, party in the back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did on the table 5.1 and section 5-7. I think one of the things that we kind of jumped over real fast.
And could you read that number again? I'm sorry.
For it's page 5-7, it would be the table 5.1 dimensional standards for building articulation. The ground floor transparency for non-residential. I just wanted to point out that some of the work that I've done especially when we get over 50% transparency, gets really hard to design a structure that's got that, and especially I think 30 and 40% is pretty good from the amount of transparency that you get. Sometimes you end up going against the grain and forcing so much transparency that all that ends up happening is blinds and curtains and shades and window treatments that then it goes right back to a blank facade. So figuring out those percentages is pretty nuanced.
Considering dropping that whole range.
Yeah, I would.
Somewhere to 30 to, consider a 30 to 40, thinking about
I dial it back a little bit. I think if it makes sense for the developer, they'll push it up. But I think, you know, there's some really great examples around town of buildings that we wouldn't think of as being super opaque transparency, but they're probably more in the like 15 to 30%. And it wouldn't be until you took like an overall of it that you realize, oh, wow, you know, really isn't that much there. But, and then conversely, if we push it too far, it'll end up not having the result. I've been dealing with that in several other cities around the state as well. Where it's been,
And LDO had noted that sometimes with greater transparency that the response was just to cut whatever the use was, to put curtains up and end up covering from the inside. So that was a comment that mirrors some of theirs. So yes, well.
I think Woodland Avenue has a set of townhomes that if you looked at those, you'd sort of see, I want to think that those were maybe 30 or 40% requirement.
We threw a lot at you today. I think you agree this is a pretty comprehensive update of the zoning ordinance. You probably get the intent here is to try to create a lot more flexibility and allowing more opportunities for mixing residential types, but also mixing uses. A lot of these districts won't be mapped. I mean, there will be changes to the entitlements of property just based on what we've changed in some of the districts, but we will be mapping largely, almost completely. Everything that's mapped a certain district today will have a new district that corresponds to its existing use. So we are not changing the use or the entitlements really on anything except maybe R1, you could argue. But so the reason that is because we're trying to use the comprehensive plan process to really guide future densities and mixes of uses and other things, but be prepared for that with our zoning ordinance.
Dan, real quick, are you taking into consideration that some of the districts or the political boundaries will be changing in 2025?
I'm a planner, but I'm not that good of a planner. No, no, I'm not. I haven't thought about that at all.
Just thought I'd throw it out there.
You know, because again, we try to live in a non-political mindset in our job. So that's part of it.
I just have some quick process questions. Is the draft ordinance that's going to be released what we're going to vote on November 13th? Or might there be additional changes between then and Planning Commission?
I think we will definitely want to address some of the comments today, Karen and Brian, I guess. Probably some of them that seem pretty reasonable.
Right, there's
pretty
some
easy.
time this week to address some comments,
Yeah.
but once that draft is, should we just assume that once that draft is released, that's what we're going to see?
Yeah.
Okay. For
Again,
consistency across the board, so we all know. And then if we have comments between now and that draft, who do we direct those to?
Brian and Eric.
Okay,
Brian,
great.
Karen. And again, the goal has been to get this to council before the end of the year, and I think we're trying to stay on target with that.
I want to acknowledge all the staff that has spent 2.5 years working on this. We've had meetings, 2 and 3 times a week. They're 2 hours each minimum. So I really want to thank you guys for all the work you've put in. And this actually started a little bit prior to the Kelly administration. The consultant was hired during the end of the Burke administration. So this has been a long process, and the city owes you a debt of gratitude for that. Thank you.
I agree. And again, I would just reinforce what I said at the beginning. I don't see this as, when this is adopted, we've achieved the goal. I feel like we're going to probably come back and tweak some things and correct some things in months after that. We absolutely next year will spend a good amount of the time reflecting on what's still missing, what could be better. our peers in this state are actually ahead of us, I mean, on some of this. I'll be honest with you. Go to look at the city of Knoxville's Missing Middle website, or go look at Memphis and all the things they're doing with Opticos and their consultant who wrote the Missing Middle book, or look at Nashville. A lot of them have done things that, I'm not saying we want to be those places, but they have more flexibility in their codes. You can argue if the outcomes have been better or not, but I think it's, we're trying to get out of this 50-year-old zoning code mode. So that's the goal.
And last week, actually, to Dan's point, Mayor Kelly suggested that we that we review this quarterly for at least the first year, even if the review is just an internal, senior staff and RPA and myself, just looking at it, every few months for the first year, and then an annual review after that. This is a living document. There's no such thing as a perfect ordinance or piece of legislation, and things change over time. It's something that, we shouldn't pass it and then not look at it again for 20 years.
And we can include that as part of the planning commission resolution, that review cycle, and that planning commission resolutions move on to council and reflect similar language.
Anything else? Councilman Ledford?
So, Dan, I hear you loud and clear. You want to get this off of the plate and on to the city council. So, and Chris said it very clearly, 2.5 years before. That's amazing. City council has a lot of issues they're dealing with. We have a housing plan that we had one work session on. We have this. We're getting it ready to go into a holiday season. I think in December, we're missing maybe 2 meetings. I get it, but you're pushing hard.
Merry Christmas, council person.
Well, you may,
and you left off the budget starting.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying
Well, we have a lot of
that's
confidence in you.
That's a lot. That's a lot to digest. So, thanks.
Councilman, I'll say that there's always going to be something in my experience that as you well know, 6.5 years into your tenure, there's never going to be an easy going time at city council. But to Dan's point, we did commit to the body that they would have it before the end of the year. And we're very committed to giving you something that you can pass at city council by the end of the year that doesn't drag into next year when Dan's right. Then it's going to be the budget, and the housing plan is going to need to be tweaked. And then something else is going to catch on fire that we have to deal with. And we want to pursue this very aggressively.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.